Sometimes the hardest choices come when your heart tells you to save the very person who could destroy you. In a world where honor is rare and survival is everything, one woman's mercy changes two lives forever. In the village of Hargvik, a giant warrior named Erik stands in chains at auction. He refused to burn innocent homes and now faces slavery. Freya lost her family to raids, but she sees something in this fallen warrior that others miss. She spends her last gold to buy his freedom. By Viking law, he claims her as his shield-maiden. What happens when mercy meets honor in a world built on revenge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the thatched roofs of Hargvik like the memory of tears that refused to dry. 3 seasons had passed since the great raids swept through the coastal settlements, leaving behind a patchwork of rebuilt homes and hearts that still ached with loss. Freya pressed her fingers against the worn silver pendant at her throat, her mother's last gift, and watched the steam rise from her wooden cup of birch tea. From her small window, she could see the village square where merchants already gathered, their voices carrying across the damp air. Market day brought traders from distant settlements, but today felt different. Whispers had reached Hargvik 2 days prior about a special auction, something that had drawn men with heavier purses and harder eyes than the usual fish sellers and wool traders. Another grey morning, Astrid muttered from across the cramped dwelling they shared. The older woman's weathered hands worked steadily at her loom, weaving the same pattern she'd known since childhood. The sun hasn't shown its face properly in a week. Freya nodded absently, her thoughts drifting to the coins hidden beneath her sleeping furs, the last remnants of her family's modest wealth. 12 pieces of silver, each one representing a choice between today's comfort and tomorrow's uncertainty. Her father had been a skilled blacksmith before the raids, her mother known throughout the settlement for her healing knowledge. Now their daughter survived on the kindness of neighbors and her own careful rationing. "You're thinking too hard again," Astrid observed, not looking up from her work. "I can hear the wheels turning in your head from here." The older woman had taken Freya in after the raids, when the smoke finally cleared and the dead were counted. Astrid's own husband had fallen defending the grain stores, leaving her alone in a dwelling that felt too large for one person's grief. 2 broken women, she'd said that first night, might make one whole enough to survive. The merchants seemed different today, Freya said, setting down her cup. "More of them, and they're not displaying their usual wares." Astrid's hands stilled on the loom. She'd lived through enough seasons to recognize when the wind carried more than morning moisture. "Slave traders," she said quietly. "I heard Bjorn mention it to his wife yesterday. Someone important fell from grace, important enough to draw buyers from 3 settlements. The words settled in Freya's chest, like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of unease through her morning calm. Slavery was a harsh reality in their world, but it usually involved prisoners taken in raids or criminals who'd committed grave offenses. For traders to gather from distant villages meant this auction carried unusual weight. Bjorn the Elder appeared in their doorway before Freya could voice her concerns. His grey beard, still thick despite his 60 winters, bore droplets of mist that caught the pale morning light. As the settlement's informal leader since the raids claimed their jarl, his presence meant serious business. "Ladies," he said, inclining his weathered head with the courtesy that marked him as a man of old-fashioned honor. "I come with news that may concern us all." Astrid set aside her weaving and gestured for him to enter. The dwelling barely accommodated 3 people, but hospitality demanded proper welcome. Freya moved to pour him tea from the earthenware pot that stayed warm near their small fire. "The auction draws men I'd rather not see in our settlement," Bjorn began, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. "Traders from the Iron Shore, mercenaries from the northern reaches. Word has spread about today's prize." "What prize?" Freya asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Bjorn's expression grew heavy. "Erik Bareborn, son of Jarl Magnus the Red. They've branded him traitor and outlaw. He's to be sold as a slave to the highest bidder. The name struck Freya like a physical blow. Every child in the coastal settlements knew the stories of Erik Bareborn, a warrior whose strength in battle matched his father's legendary brutality. The Bareborn clan had ruled the northern reaches for 3 generations, their longships carrying death and plunder to settlements up and down the coast. Yet, as Bjorn continued speaking, the familiar tale took unexpected turns. 6 months ago, Magnus ordered his son to lead raids against the southern valleys. Peaceful farming settlements, mostly places that paid tribute and caused no trouble. Erik refused. The old man paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Not just refused, he stood before his father's war council and declared that burning innocent homes made men no better than animals. Astrid drew in a sharp breath. In their world, defying a Jarl's direct orders meant death or exile. For a son to challenge his father's authority in front of warriors meant something far worse. Magnus couldn't kill his own son without losing face among the clans, Bjorn continued, but he couldn't let such defiance go unpunished. So he declared Erik traitor to the family name, stripped him of rank and property, and sold him to slave traders. Freya found herself gripping her mother's pendant so tightly the silver edges bit into her palm. The raids that had destroyed her family, that had taken her parents and left her orphaned Erik Bareborn, had refused to lead more of them. "Why bring him here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hargvik lies between 3 major settlements," Bjorn explained. "Neutral ground, where buyers can gather without starting territorial disputes. The traders thought our market square would serve their purposes." His weathered face darkened. "I couldn't refuse them entry without risking our own safety." Through the small window, Freya could see more figures moving through the square. Men in fine cloaks examining the auction platform that had been erected near the village's central fire pit. The sight made her stomach turn, their own sacred gathering place transformed into a stage for human commerce. "I wanted to warn you." "Both," Bjorn said, rising from his seat. "Stay indoors today if you can. Men with enough gold to buy warriors don't always respect the boundaries of decent folk." After he left, silence settled over the dwelling like a burial shroud. Astrid returned to her loom, but her hands moved with mechanical precision rather than their usual skilled rhythm. Freya stared out the window, watching the preparations continue. The platform stood 8 feet square, built from rough timber that had been hastily assembled, but looked sturdy enough to bear significant weight. Iron rings had been hammered into the surface restraint points that spoke to the dangerous nature of what would be displayed there. "I remember the stories about Erik Bareborn," Astrid said suddenly. "Before the troubles with his father, he had a different reputation among the settlements." Freya turned from the window. "Different how?" "Warriors talk, especially when they've been drinking. Some of the men who fought alongside him said he never took unnecessary lives, never harmed women or children, even in the heat of battle. There were stories about him stopping other raiders from burning grain stores during winter months, arguing that starving people couldn't pay tribute the following season. Practical reasons, Freya said, but something in her chest stirred at the words. "Maybe," Astrid replied, "or maybe honor runs deeper in some men than the blood that should bind them to their kin." As the morning progressed, the square filled with more figures. Freya recognized some faces from previous market days, but others wore the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence. They examined the platform like farmers inspecting livestock pens, their conversations too distant to overhear, but their purpose clear enough. The slave wagon arrived near midday, its iron-reinforced wheels cutting deep ruts in the muddy ground. 6 armed guards surrounded it, their hands never straying far from sword hilts. The crowd that had gathered pressed closer, eager for their first glimpse of the infamous prisoner. When they finally dragged Erik Bareborn from the wagon, Freya's breath caught in her throat. Even in chains, the man radiated a presence that made the armed guard seem small by comparison. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders bearing old scars that spoke of countless battles. Dark hair hung past his shoulders, partially obscuring features that might have been handsome before they'd been marked by hardship and defiance. But it was his eyes that held Freya's attention. Even from her distant window she could see they held no defeat, no plea for mercy. They burned with a quiet fury that seemed directed not at his captors, but at the injustice that had brought him to this moment. The chains that bound him were not mere restraints, but works of cruel artistry. Heavy iron links connected shackles at his wrists and ankles, while a collar around his throat bore runes that declared his status as property. Each piece had been forged to accommodate his massive frame, their weight clearly meant to humble as much as to restrain. "By the gods," Astrid whispered, joining Freya at the window. "He looks more like a caged bear than a man." The comparison felt apt. Erik moved with careful precision, each step measured to accommodate the chain's length. But beneath the forced restraint, Freya could sense coiled power, a strength that chains might contain but could never truly break. The auction began with ritual formality. A herald read Erik's crimes in the traditional manner, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. Traitor to clan and kin, defier of lawful orders. Enemy to the natural order that bound son to father. Yet with each accusation, Freya found herself thinking not of the crimes, but of what they revealed. Erik had chosen honor over family loyalty. He'd accepted exile and slavery rather than lead raids against innocent settlements. The very settlements like her own, where families gathered around fires and children learned their letters and healing women tended gardens that fed the hungry. "The bidding starts at 50 silver pieces," the herald announced. The first offers came quickly. A merchant from the Iron Shore called out 60, immediately countered by 70 from a man whose scarred face suggested military background. The price climbed steadily, each increment representing months of honest labor for most people. Freya's hand moved unconsciously to the small leather pouch hidden beneath her clothing. 12 pieces of silver, her entire remaining inheritance. Not nearly enough to compete with the merchants and mercenaries who threw around gold like common copper. 100 silver pieces, called a voice that made several people step back. The speaker wore rich furs and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Freya didn't recognize him, but his presence seemed to cow the other bidders. 110, came a weaker response from across the square. 125. The counter-bids grew hesitant, then stopped altogether. Freya watched Erik's face throughout the bidding, searching for some reaction to his fate being decided by strangers. He showed nothing, no fear, no anger, no resignation. His gaze swept the crowd with the detached interest of someone observing events that concerned other people. 125 silver pieces. Once, the herald called. Twice. Wait! The word escaped Freya's lips before she'd consciously decided to speak. But once it was out, something deep in her chest unclenched, as if a decision she'd been avoiding had finally made itself. She was moving before Astrid could protest, pushing through the dwelling's door and into the muddy square. Her feet carried her forward with purpose that felt both completely foreign and utterly natural. The crowd parted as she approached the platform, some faces showing recognition, others mere curiosity. She pulled the leather pouch from beneath her cloak, feeling its meager weight against her palm. 12 gold pieces, she called out, her voice stronger than she'd expected. The square fell silent, except for the sound of rain beginning to patter against thatched roofs. Gold was worth 10 times its weight in silver, making her bid equivalent to 120 pieces, barely matching the current offer. "Miss," the herald said carefully, "the current bid is 125 silver pieces. Your 12 gold pieces match 120 silver. Then I bid 13 gold pieces," she replied, though the words made her stomach clench. She had no 13th piece, but something in Erik's eyes had shifted when he looked at her. Not gratitude, something deeper and more complicated. "I don't have 13, she admitted, her voice carrying across the silent square. "But I have something else." She reached for her mother's pendant, her fingers trembling as she lifted the silver chain over her head. The pendant caught what little light penetrated the grey morning, a simple piece, but beautifully crafted and obviously ancient. "This belonged to my mother, and her mother before that. It's worth at least 3 gold pieces to anyone who appreciates fine silver work." The herald examined the pendant with practiced eyes, then nodded reluctantly. "The bid stands at 13 gold pieces. No counter-offers came." The man in rich furs studied Freya with obvious displeasure, but seemed unwilling to escalate the bidding for reasons she couldn't fathom. "Sold," the herald declared after the traditional 3 calls went unanswered. What happened next moved too quickly for clear thought. Erik stepped forward as his shackles were removed, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire platform. But instead of the grateful subservience she'd expected, he dropped to one knee before her. "By the ancient laws of blood debt and the sacred bonds that tie protector to protected," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square, "I claim this woman as my shield-maiden. Her life is bound to mine, mine to hers, until death or sacred release parts us." The words hit Freya like a physical blow. Shield-maiden, the ancient title for a woman who fought beside a warrior as both partner and equal. But more than that, in the old traditions, claiming someone as shield-maiden created bonds that superseded all other loyalties, including the debt of slavery she'd just purchased. "You can't," she began, but Erik's eyes held hers with an intensity that stopped her words. "It's done," he said quietly, rising to his full height. "The old laws still hold power, even in places that have forgotten their meaning. You bought my freedom with gold and silver, but you gave it back with a choice that honors both our ancestors." Around them, the crowd began to disperse, some muttering about ancient customs and others discussing the morning's unexpected outcome. But Freya barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the man standing before her, no longer a slave, but something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The silence that followed Erik's declaration stretched like a taut bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Freya stared up at the towering warrior, her mind reeling from the weight of words she barely understood. Shield-maiden, the ancient bond her grandmother had spoken of in whispered stories, but which belonged to a time when gods walked among mortals and honor meant more than survival. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain that had begun to fall in earnest. Erik's expression remained steady, but she caught something in his eyes, not regret, but a deep weariness that spoke of choices made from necessity rather than desire. "I have honored the debt between us while freeing us both from endos. Chains we didn't choose." The crowd continued to disperse, but several figures lingered at the square's edges. The man in rich furs who had been bidding against her stood near the merchant stalls, his attention fixed on Erik with obvious displeasure. Other buyers muttered among themselves, their investments in the morning's entertainment thoroughly disrupted. Bjorn approached the platform with careful steps, his weathered face troubled. "Erik Bareborn," he said formally, "Hargvik offers you guest right for 3 days. As is proper for any free man who enters our settlement peacefully." "I accept your hospitality," Erik replied, inclining his head with the courtesy of one leader acknowledging another. "And I swear by the old oaths that no harm will come to your people through my presence." But even as the ritual words were spoken, Freya could sense undercurrents of tension that had nothing to do with ancient customs. The lingering buyers, the whispered conversations, the way some villagers watched Erik with expressions that mixed fear and fascination. All of it suggested that his presence in Hargvik would bring complications none of them had anticipated. "We should return to the dwelling," Astrid said quietly, appearing at Freya's side with the practical wisdom that had kept them both alive through the harsh months after the raids. "There's much that needs discussing, and the square is no place for it." The walk back to their modest home felt like crossing a vast distance rather than the 50 paces it actually required. Erik moved beside them with the measured gait of someone accustomed to having his movements watched and judged. The chains were gone, but Freya could see their impact in the careful way he held his shoulders, the unconscious testing of each step's freedom. Their dwelling, which had felt cramped with 2 women, became impossibly small, with Erik's massive frame filling the doorway. He had to duck to clear the lintel, and once inside, his presence seemed to absorb all the available air. "Sit," Astrid commanded, gesturing toward their single wooden chair with the authority of a woman whose hospitality brooked no argument. "You look ready to fall over." Erik complied with surprising grace for someone his size, though the chair creaked ominously under his weight. Freya busied herself preparing tea, grateful for the familiar ritual, while her thoughts struggled to process the morning's events. "Tell me about shield-maiden bonds," she said without looking at him, focusing on the steady rhythm of pouring hot water over dried herbs. "My grandmother mentioned them, but only in stories." "The stories are mostly true," Erik replied, accepting a cup with hands that dwarfed the simple pottery. "In the old days, when a warrior and a woman formed such a bond, it created obligations and protections that superseded family ties, clan loyalty, even royal commands." Astrid settled onto her sleeping furs, her expression thoughtful. "But those were different times. Do such bonds still hold legal weight among those who remember the old laws?" "Yes." Erik's voice carried a conviction that made Freya look up from her own tea. "A shield maiden cannot be harmed without answering to her warrior. A warrior cannot abandon his shield maiden without forfeiting his honor. The bond can only be broken by mutual consent or death." The implications hit Freya like cold water. "You're saying that by claiming me, you've made yourself responsible for my safety?" "More than that." Erik met her eyes steadily. "I've made us responsible for each other. In the old traditions, shield-maiden bonds were partnerships of equals, one person's strength covering the other's vulnerabilities. But I'm not a warrior," Freya protested. "I can barely swing an axe to split firewood, much less fight beside someone in battle." "Strength takes many forms," Erik said quietly. "This morning, you showed more courage than most warriors I've known. You risked everything to save someone you had every reason to hate." The words stirred something uncomfortable in Freya's chest. She had acted on instinct, driven by a recognition of honor that she couldn't fully explain. But courage? The idea seemed absurd when applied to someone who spent most days struggling simply to survive. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why claim me at all? You could have simply accepted your freedom and left Hargvik behind." Erik was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the teacup in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "Because debt creates its own chains," he said finally. "You freed me from slavery, but that would have left me bound to you by obligation I could never repay. The shield-maiden bond transforms debt into partnership. It honors what you did while giving us both the freedom to choose how we face what comes next." "And what does come next?" Astrid asked, with the practical directness that made fall. Her such a valuable friend. Before Erik could answer, rapid footsteps approached their door. Bjorn appeared again, but this time his expression held urgency rather than formal courtesy. "Trouble?" he said without preamble. "The buyers who lost the auction aren't taking their disappointment gracefully. There's talk of challenging the sale, claiming irregularities in the bidding process." Erik's entire demeanor shifted, muscles tensing beneath his worn clothing. "What kind of challenge?" "The man in the rich furs calls himself Torben the Gold Hand, says a maiden can't legally purchase a warrior slave without a male guardian's consent. He's demanding the auction be voided," and Erik returned to the bidding block. Freya felt ice form in her stomach. "Can he do that?" "Not under the old laws," Bjorn replied grimly, "but Torben has gold, armed men, and no particular respect for traditions that inconvenience him. He's offering the original sellers twice what you paid if they'll declare the sale invalid. The sound of approaching horses reached them through the dwelling's thin walls, multiple riders moving with military precision. Erik rose from his chair with fluid motion, his eyes taking on the alert intensity of a predator sensing danger. "How many men does Torben have with him?" he asked. "6 that I can see, possibly more waiting outside the settlement." Astrid began gathering their few valuable possessions with practiced efficiency. 3 seasons of post-raid survival had taught all of them to prepare for rapid departure when violence threatened. "There's another way," Erik said quietly. "If we can reach the sacred grove before they corner us here, we can invoke sanctuary rites. Even men like Torben hesitate to spill blood on ground blessed by the old gods." "The grove is half a mile through open ground," Bjorn pointed out. "You'd never make it unseen." "Then we don't try to be unseen," Erik replied, something dangerous entering his voice. "We make them come to us on ground of our choosing." Freya watched the exchange with growing alarm. The morning had begun with a simple act of mercy, but each choice seemed to lead toward greater complications. Now they faced the possibility of violence, of men dying over a transaction that had felt right but might prove legally meaningless. "There has to be another solution," she said, though her words sounded hollow even to herself. Erik turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw not the defeated slave from the auction block, but the warrior he'd been before chains and exile stripped away his rank. "In my experience, men like Torben only understand one kind of negotiation. The question is whether you're prepared for the cost." The sound of boots on muddy ground grew closer, accompanied by voices that carried the confidence of men accustomed to having their demands met. Freya gripped her empty teacup so tightly she feared it might shatter, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead toward outcomes she wasn't prepared to face. "Whatever comes next," she said finally, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "we face it together. That's what the bond means, isn't it?" Erik's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across his weathered features. "Yes," he said simply, "that's exactly what it means." Outside, the footsteps stopped just beyond their door, and a voice called out with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "Erik Bareborn, come out and face the consequences of your invalid freedom." The moment of reckoning had arrived, and with it, the first true test of bonds, forged in desperation, but tempered by something deeper than either of them had expected to find. The voice outside their door carried the weight of authority backed by steel, but Erik's response came with the calm precision of a man who had faced far worse threats than gold-handed merchants and their hired swords. "Torben the Gold Hand," Erik called back, his voice carrying easily through the thin walls. "I know that name. You're the slave trader who specializes in buying warriors and selling them to fighting pits in the eastern kingdoms." A pause, then laughter that held no warmth. "My business practices are irrelevant, Bareborn. What matters is that your freedom was purchased through fraudulent means. A maiden cannot buy a warrior without proper male consent." Freya felt anger flare in her chest, not just at the insult to her independence, but at the casual dismissal of her right to make her own choices. She started toward the door, but Erik's hand on her shoulder stopped her with gentle firmness. "Let me," he said quietly. "This isn't about law or tradition. It's about power, and men like Torben only respect force." He moved to the door with careful deliberation, each step measured and controlled. When he pulled it open, the contrast between his massive frame and the dwelling's modest entrance created a striking image, a giant emerging from a place too small to contain him. 6 armed men stood in the muddy yard, their weapons visible but not yet drawn. Torben himself stood apart from his hired swords, his rich clothing and soft features marking him as someone who preferred others to do his fighting. But his eyes held the calculating intelligence of a successful predator. "Erik Bareborn," Torben said with mock courtesy, looking remarkably well for a man who should be in chains. I look like a free man because that's what I am, Erik replied evenly. The auction was conducted according to proper forms, witnessed by the settlement's elder, and completed with legitimate payment. Payment made by a woman acting without male authority, Torben countered. In civilized settlements, such transactions require— We follow the old laws here, Bjorn interrupted, stepping into view from where he'd been waiting behind the merchant stalls. He wasn't alone. A dozen village men had gathered, including several who bore the scars of military service. Under those laws, a woman of age can conduct business in her own name. Torben's expression darkened, but his tone remained conversational. Old laws have a tendency to become obsolete when they conflict with practical necessity. I'm offering to purchase the slave for twice what the maiden paid. Surely that's a generous resolution to this unfortunate misunderstanding. I'm not for sale, Erik said flatly. Not to you, not to anyone. Everyone is for sale at the right price, Torben replied, with the confidence of a man who had tested that theory successfully many times. The question is whether we negotiate like civilized men or resort to more primitive methods of persuasion. Freya could see the threat for what it was: submit to Torben's demands or face violence that would endanger the entire settlement. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her choice at the auction had seemed simple in the moment, driven by recognition of honor in a world that too often rewarded its opposite. But now, that choice threatened to bring harm to people who had shown her nothing but kindness. There's a third option, she said, stepping past Erik into the doorway where everyone could see her. Both men turned toward her with expressions of surprise. Erik's tinged with concern, Torben's with dismissive amusement. The maiden speaks, Torben said mockingly. How refreshing. Please, enlighten us about this third option. Freya lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Trial by combat. Erik fights your champion, winner takes all. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a forge, heavy with implications none of them had fully considered. Trial by combat was an ancient rite, one that even corrupt merchants like Torben couldn't easily dismiss without losing face among the gathered witnesses. Freya. No, Erik said quietly. You don't understand what you're proposing, but Torben's eyes had lit up with interest. Actually, I find the suggestion fascinating. Though I would propose a modification since this dispute concerns ownership rights, the combat should be to the death. Much more definitive than simple defeat. Absolutely not, Bjorn said firmly. Combat, to first blood or yield, is sufficient to establish to the death, Torben repeated, his voice cutting through Bjorn's objection. Or, we return to my original offer, purchase the slave for twice the maiden's payment, completed immediately. Erik's entire body had gone still, but Freya could sense the tension coiling beneath his controlled exterior. She realized, with a clarity that cut through her fear, that this had been Torben's plan from the beginning. He'd never intended to simply buy Erik. He wanted to force a situation where the former Jarl's son would have to fight for his freedom, probably against impossible odds. Who would you name as champion? Erik asked, his voice carefully neutral. Torben smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter whose trap had finally been sprung. Gunnar Iron Fist. Perhaps you remember him from your father's court? The name struck Erik like a physical blow, though he managed to keep his expression steady. Freya saw his jaw tighten, his hands clench, almost imperceptibly. Whatever history existed between Erik and this Gunnar, it clearly ran deeper than simple rivalry. I remember, Erik said quietly. He was my father's executioner, good at killing bound men and unarmed prisoners. He's also undefeated in formal combat, Torben added with obvious pleasure. 16 victories, including 3 against men who were considered legendary warriors. But perhaps the great Erik Bareborn has lost his taste for honest fighting? The insult was carefully crafted, designed to force Erik into a choice between his pride and his survival. Freya watched his internal struggle, understanding that the moment would define not just their immediate future, but the nature of the bond they'd forged. "I accept," Erik said finally, his words falling like stones into still water. "No," Freya said immediately. "I withdraw the challenge. This isn't worth your life." "The challenge has been accepted by both parties," Torben said with legal precision. "It cannot be withdrawn without mutual consent, and I do not consent." Bjorn stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "When and where?" "Tomorrow, at dawn, in the sacred grove. Let the gods witness whose cause holds greater justice." Torben's smile had taken on a predatory quality. "I trust that's acceptable to all parties?" Erik nodded slowly. "Acceptable." As Torben and his men departed, their confident laughter echoing across the settlement, Freya felt the full weight of what she'd set in motion. Her attempt to find an honorable solution had instead created a trap that might cost Erik his life. "Why did you accept?" she asked as they returned to the dwelling. "You could have refused, let them take their gold and find another solution." Erik's expression was thoughtful rather than angry. "Because running from men like Torben only delays the inevitable, and because Gunnar Iron Fist owes me a debt that has nothing to do with gold or slavery." "What kind of debt?" "The kind that can only be settled with blood," Erik replied grimly. "Tomorrow's combat isn't just about your gold or my freedom. It's about justice for crimes that have gone unpunished for too long." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Freya began to understand that her simple act of mercy had become entangled with vengeances and histories far older and more complex than anything she'd imagined. The hours after Torben's departure passed with agonizing slowness, each minute weighted with the knowledge of what dawn would bring. Erik sat by their small fire, methodically checking and cleaning weapons that Bjorn had quietly provided: a sword, a battle axe, and a CX knife that had seen better days but still held keen edges. Freya found herself unable to sit still, pacing the small confines of their dwelling like a caged animal. The simple wooden bowl she'd inherited from her mother sat on the table, half filled with water that had grown cold hours ago. She kept returning to it, staring at her reflection in the still surface, as if it might reveal answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "You're wearing a path in the floor," Astrid observed dryly, though her usual sharp humor carried an undertone of concern. "Sit before you collapse." "I can't," Freya replied, pausing by the window to peer out at the darkening settlement. "Every time I close my eyes, I see tomorrow morning. I see death," Erik said quietly, not looking up from the sword he was testing for balance. "You see me dying because of a choice you made with good intentions." The blunt words hit harder than any accusation might have. Freya turned from the window, anger flaring in her chest. "Don't you dare make this about guilt. You accepted the challenge. You could have refused." "Could I?" Erik set the sword aside and finally met her eyes. "Gunnar Iron Fist isn't just Torben's champion. He's the man who executed my younger brother on my father's orders." The revelation struck the room like lightning, leaving silence in its wake. Freya sank onto her sleeping furs, the strength going out of her legs. "Your brother?" Olaf was 17, barely old enough to grow a proper beard. "He spoke out against a raid. My father planned a raid against a settlement full of refugees who'd already lost everything to previous attacks." Erik's voice remained steady, but his hands had clenched into fists. Magnus called it treason. Gunnar made it official with an axe. Astrid drew in a sharp breath. "How long ago?" 2 years. The same season I began refusing my father's orders." Erik's expression had turned inward, lost in memories that clearly brought no comfort. "Olaf died because he had the courage to speak truth when everyone else stayed silent. I've been living with that shame ever since." Understanding dawned in Freya's mind, like sunrise after a long night. "That's why you refused to lead the raids against the farming settlements. You were honoring your brother's memory, honoring it and trying to prevent more innocent deaths. Erik picked up the battle axe, testing its weight with practiced movements. But honor doesn't win battles against men who fight without conscience. Then, why accept the combat? Freya pressed. If you know Gunnar's reputation, if you know the odds, because some debts can only be paid in blood. Erik interrupted, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. And because running from this fight would dishonor not just my brother's memory, but the courage you showed this morning. The weight of responsibility settled even more heavily on Freya's shoulders. Her act of mercy at the auction had seemed so clear, so obviously right, but each consequence had led to greater complications, and now Erik might die because she'd tried to save him. There has to be another way, she said desperately. What if we left Hargvik tonight, disappeared into the wilderness before dawn, and abandon an entire settlement to Torben's anger? Erik shook his head. Men like him don't forget insults. If we ran, he'd take his frustration out on Bjorn and the others who supported us. Astrid had been silent during their exchange, but now she spoke with the practical wisdom that had kept her alive through decades of hardship. What do you need to win? Erik looked at her with something like gratitude. Honest question. Gunnar is younger, faster, and has been training constantly while I've been in chains. He's also cruel enough to fight dirty when clean methods fail. But, Astrid prompted, clearly hearing something in his tone that suggested more than resignation, but he's also arrogant. He's won so many fights against lesser opponents that he's forgotten how to respect an enemy who might actually be dangerous. Erik's expression grew thoughtful. And he has one weakness that he's never learned to control, which is rage. When Gunnar gets angry, he stops thinking tactically and starts trying to overwhelm opponents through pure aggression. If I can make him angry enough, you'll have an opening, Freya finished, beginning to understand the strategy. A slim one, Erik admitted, but better than trying to match him strength for strength. The conversation was interrupted by soft footsteps outside their door. Bjorn appeared, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman Freya didn't recognize stood beside him, elderly, with silver hair braided in the complex patterns that marked her as someone of significant status. This is Ragnar the Wise, Bjorn said formally. She serves as settlement healer and keeper of the old traditions. The old woman stepped forward, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious understanding. I've come to offer what help I can for tomorrow's combat. What kind of help? Erik asked, rising to show proper respect. Ragnar reached into her leather satchel and withdrew several small clay vessels. Healing salves, pain-dulling herbs, and something to help keep your mind clear when exhaustion sets in. Nothing that violates the rules of formal combat, but every advantage within honorable limits. I appreciate the gesture, Erik said carefully, but accepting help might give Torben grounds to claim unfairness in the contest. Let me worry about Torben's objections, Ragnar replied with a dismissive wave. I've been preparing warriors for combat since before he was born. Nothing I offer crosses the line into dishonor. As the old healer began explaining the properties of each preparation, Freya found herself studying Erik's face. The resigned acceptance she'd seen earlier had been replaced by something more complex, not quite hope, but a grim determination that suggested he'd found reasons to fight beyond mere duty. There's something else, Ragnar said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. Word has reached me that Gunnar has been drinking heavily since his arrival. Torben's other men are concerned about his condition for tomorrow's fight. Concerned how? Freya asked. Drinking can dull pain, but it also slows reflexes and clouds judgment, the healer explained. If Gunnar is suffering from wine sickness tomorrow morning, then my chances improve significantly, Erik finished. Thank you, Ragnar. This information may prove as valuable as any salve. After the healer departed, the three of them settled into the kind of watchful quiet that precedes significant events. Erik returned to his weapon preparation, but now his movements carried more purpose than resignation. Astrid busied herself preparing what might be their last meal together, though none of them spoke that possibility aloud. Freya remained by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. In her hands, she turned the simple wooden bowl over and over, feeling its familiar weight, and wondering if tomorrow would bring the end of everything they'd built together, or the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. Dawn came reluctantly, filtering through heavy clouds that promised another day of rain. Freya had dozed fitfully against the wall, but true sleep had remained elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, images of combat filled her mind, steel against steel, blood on sacred ground, and the terrible possibility that Erik's courage might not be enough to overcome superior skill and younger reflexes. Erik had spent the dark hours in preparation that seemed almost ritualistic. He'd cleaned and oiled his weapons until they gleamed, then arranged them with the precise care of a man who understood that his life might depend on reaching each tool, exactly when needed. The borrowed sword lay beside the battle-axe and sea-axe knife, forming a trinity of steel that caught the pale morning light. The rune stone, Erik said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over their dwelling. "I need you to bring my father's rune stone to the combat circle." Freya looked up from where she'd been staring at her hands. "What rune stone?" "It should be among the possessions Torben's people seized when they captured me. A small granite disc with the Bearborn family mark carved into one side." Erik's expression had taken on an intensity that made her pay careful attention. "According to the old laws, a warrior has the right to carry one personal item into formal combat, something that connects him to his ancestors and his purpose. But wouldn't that belong to your father now, since he disowned you? The stone belonged to my grandfather, and his grandfather before him. It carries the marks of every Bearborn warrior who ever faced death in service to honor rather than conquest." Erik's voice carried a reverence that transformed the simple object into something approaching the sacred. "Magnus can disown a son, but he cannot sever bloodlines that stretch back to the gods themselves." Astrid had been listening with the careful attention she gave to anything that might affect their survival. "Will Torben hand over such a thing willingly?" "He'll have to," Erik replied. "The right to ancestral tokens in formal combat is recognized even by men who ignore most other traditions. Refusing would mark him as someone who fears his champion needs every possible advantage." The implications weren't lost on any of them. If Torben felt confident in Gunnar's victory, he'd have no reason to deny Erik such a small comfort. But if he harbored doubts about the outcome, he might look for excuses to tip the scales further in his champion's favor. "I'll ask for the stone," Freya said, though the thought of confronting Torben again made her stomach clench with anxiety. "We'll ask together," Erik corrected gently. "This isn't your burden to bear alone." They made their way through Hargvik's muddy streets as the settlement slowly awakened around them. Word of the coming combat had spread during the night, and more people were stirring than usual for such an early hour. Faces appeared in doorways and windows, some curious, others concerned, a few showing the grim anticipation that violent spectacles always seem to inspire. The sacred grove lay a quarter-mile beyond the settlement's edge, marked by standing stones that had weathered countless seasons of wind and rain. Ancient oaks formed a natural circle around a clearing where generations of disputes had been settled through trial by combat. Moss-covered altars bore the stains of offerings made to gods, whose names were half forgotten, but whose power still commanded respect. Torben had established his camp near the grove's entrance, his men arranged around a fire that sent smoke curling toward the grey sky. They looked alert, despite the early hour, hands resting casually near weapon hilts with the ease of professional soldiers. Gunnar Ironfist sat apart from the others, methodically sharpening a war axe whose blade gleamed with recent attention. The legendary executioner looked exactly as dangerous as his reputation suggested, tall and powerfully built, with shoulders that spoke of years wielding heavy weapons in deadly earnest. Scars marked his arms and face, not the random injuries of unlucky combat, but the precise marks left by opponents skilled enough to land blows before dying for their efforts. "Erik Bareborn," Torben called out as they approached. "Come to beg for mercy, or simply to admire the man who'll be sending you to join your ancestors?" "I've come to claim my right to an ancestral token," Erik replied evenly, ignoring the insult with the dignity of someone who'd learned not to be goaded by lesser men. Torben's expression shifted from mockery to calculation. "What token?" "The Bareborn rune stone, a granite disc that should be among the possessions taken when I was captured." "Ah, yes," Torben said, after a moment's consideration. "I remember such an item. Crude carving, hardly worth the stone it's etched into. But you'll honor the traditional right to carry it?" Freya asked, stepping forward to stand beside Erik. Gunnar Ironfist looked up from his weapon maintenance, his cold eyes studying Erik with the calculating gaze of a predator measuring prey. "Let him have his pretty rock," he said dismissively. "It won't help him when steel meets flesh." The casual contempt in Gunnar's voice carried undertones that made Freya's skin crawl. This was a man who had killed so many times that death had become routine, stripped of weight or meaning beyond the mechanical satisfaction of victory. Torben gestured to one of his men, who produced a leather satchel and began searching through its contents. After a few moments, he withdrew a disc of grey granite about the size of a man's palm. Even from a distance, Freya could see the intricate runic carvings that covered its surface symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the uncertain morning light. "Your ancestral token," Torben said, tossing the stone to Erik with deliberate carelessness. Erik caught it with reverent care, his fingers tracing the carved symbols as if drawing strength from their ancient meanings. For a moment his expression softened with what might have been memory or prayer. Then the warrior's mask settled back into place, hard and determined. "The combat begins when the sun clears the tree line," Gunnar announced, rising from his seat with fluid grace that belied his massive size. "I trust you've made peace with whatever gods you serve?" "I serve justice," Erik replied quietly, "and justice has been waiting 2 years to find you." Something flickered in Gunnar's eyes at those words, not fear, but a recognition that suggested Erik's meaning hadn't been lost on him. The executioner's hand tightened on his axe handle, and for a moment the careful confidence he'd displayed cracked enough to reveal the killer beneath. 2 years, Gunnar mused. Long enough for grief to fester into foolishness. Your brother died because he forgot his place. Today you'll join him because you've forgotten yours. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the gods themselves. Erik's grip on the rune stone tightened until his knuckles went white, but his voice remained controlled when he responded. "Today we'll see whose place the gods truly recognize." As the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the grove's canopy, casting long shadows across the sacred ground, both men moved toward the combat circle with the measured pace of those who understood that the next few minutes would determine not just victory or defeat, but the very nature of justice, in a world that too often rewarded cruelty over honor. The sacred grove held its breath as the 2 warriors entered the combat circle, their footsteps muffled by centuries of fallen leaves that had been allowed to decompose undisturbed on holy ground. Witnesses gathered at the circle's edge, villagers from Hargvik mixed with Torben's hired men, their faces reflecting the primal fascination that violent spectacles always inspired in civilized people. Freya found herself positioned between Bjorn and Astrid, close enough to see every detail, but far enough back to avoid interfering with the ancient ritual about to unfold. Her hands trembled as she watched Erik test his footing on the soft earth, the runestone visible in his left hand like a talisman against the darkness that Gunnar represented. The executioner moved with predatory confidence, his war axe held with the casual ease of someone who'd wielded it in countless similar situations. Despite the early hour and rumors of heavy drinking, he showed no signs of impairment. If anything, he seemed more focused than during their earlier confrontation, his attention fixed on Erik with the intensity of a hunter who'd finally cornered dangerous prey. "By the ancient laws and under the witness of the gods," Bjorn called out in his formal elder's voice, "let this combat be conducted with honor. Victory to the man whose cause holds greater justice, and death to his opponent," Gunnar added with a cold smile that transformed his scarred features into something inhuman. Erik said nothing, but his grip shifted on his borrowed sword. The blade caught morning light filtering through the oak canopy, sending flickers of brightness across the sacred stones that ringed their fighting ground. In that moment, Freya could see both the warrior he'd been and the exile he'd become, strength tempered by hardship, skill honed by necessity rather than choice. The combatants began their deadly dance with the caution of experienced fighters who understood that first blood often determined final victory. They circled each other like wolves, weapons ready but not yet committed to attacks that might leave them vulnerable to counterstrokes. Gunnar struck first, his axe describing a brutal arc aimed at Erik's left shoulder. The blow came faster than seemed possible for such a heavy weapon, but Erik's sword met it with perfect timing, steel ringing against steel in a sound that echoed off the standing stones like thunder. The force of the impact drove Erik back 2 steps, his feet sliding in the soft earth. Gunnar pressed his advantage immediately, following up with a series of attacks that showcased not just strength, but genuine skill. His axe work was economical and precise, each strike designed to either kill outright or create openings for the finishing blow. But Erik had fought against superior opponents before. He gave ground steadily but never carelessly, his sword work displaying the defensive mastery that had made him legendary among his father's warriors. Where Gunnar sought to overwhelm through aggression, Erik absorbed and redirected, letting his opponent's fury work against him. "Stand still and die like your brother did." Gunnar snarled, his axe whistling past Erik's head by inches. The mention of Olaf had its intended effect. Erik's careful composure cracked for just an instant, his next parry coming a heartbeat too late. Gunnar's axe blade scraped along his ribs, drawing first blood and sending crimson spatters across the sacred ground. A cheer went up from Torben's men, but Erik's response surprised them. Instead of falling back in pain or panic, he stepped forward into Gunnar's guard, his sword pommel striking the executioner's jaw with bone-crushing force. Gunnar staggered, blood streaming from his split lip, but recovered with the resilience of someone accustomed to taking punishment. His return strike came purely from instinct, a vicious upward cut that would have opened Erik from groin to sternum if it had connected properly. Erik twisted away at the last possible moment, the axe blade slicing through his shirt, but missing flesh by a finger's width. As Gunnar's momentum carried him forward, Erik's knee drove into his opponent's stomach with enough force to double him over. For a moment, victory seemed within reach. Erik raised his sword for a killing blow to the back of Gunnar's exposed neck, but the executioner proved why his reputation had spread across 3 kingdoms. Rolling forward with serpentine quickness, he swept Erik's legs and sent the larger man crashing to the ground. Gunnar's axe descended in a killing stroke that would have ended the combat immediately, but Erik managed to roll aside at the last instant. The heavy blade buried itself in the soft earth where his head had been, and in the moment it took Gunnar to free his weapon, Erik regained his feet and the advantage of distance. "Not bad for a disgraced exile," Gunnar admitted, breathing heavily from their exertions. "But you're fighting the wrong battle, Bareborn. This isn't about your brother's death, it's about accepting that some men are born to rule while others are born to serve. Is that what you told yourself when you murdered an unarmed boy?" Erik replied, his voice carrying across the grove with deadly quiet. "That you were serving some higher purpose?" "I served my Jarl's command," Gunnar shot back. "Your brother died because he forgot that questioning authority has consequences. My brother died because you enjoyed killing someone who couldn't fight back. The accusation hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Around the circle's edge, witnesses leaned forward, sensing that the combat had moved beyond simple violence into something more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Gunnar's expression darkened with genuine anger for the first time since the fight began. Careful, exile, your words are about to buy you the same fate as your precious brother. Then come and collect the price, Erik said simply, shifting his stance to invite attack. The executioner obliged with berserker fury, his axe work becoming a blur of deadly steel that forced Erik to give ground rapidly. But where Gunnar's earlier attacks had been calculated and precise, these were driven by rage that clouded tactical judgment. Erik weathered the storm of strikes with increasing confidence, recognizing the pattern he'd hoped to provoke. When Gunnar overextended himself with a particularly vicious swing, Erik was ready with a counter that opened a long gash across the executioner's sword arm. Blood flowed freely now from both combatants, staining the sacred earth with the color of justice long delayed. But something had shifted in the balance between them. Gunnar's attacks, while still dangerous, carried less precision than before. Pain and fury were undermining the cold calculation that had made him unbeatable against lesser opponents. Erik pressed forward for the first time since the combat began, his sword weaving patterns that forced Gunnar to respond defensively. The rune stone in his left hand seemed to pulse with ancestral power, connecting him to generations of bear-born warriors who had fought for honor rather than conquest. As the sun climbed higher through the oak canopy, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their deadly dance, both men understood that the next exchange would likely determine not just their own fates, but the nature of justice in a world that too often rewarded cruelty over courage. The final exchange came with the sudden violence of lightning striking earth. Gunnar, his face contorted with rage and pain, threw himself forward in a desperate attack that abandoned all pretense of defensive caution. His axe swept toward Erik's neck in an arc designed to separate head from shoulders with brutal finality. Erik ducked under the killing stroke and drove his sword upward with all the strength his wounded body could muster. The blade punched through Gunnar's leather vest and into his chest, sliding between ribs to find the heart that had driven so much cruelty into the world. Gunnar's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. His axe tumbled from nerveless fingers as he looked down at the steel protruding from his body. Blood foamed at his lips when he tried to speak, the words lost in a death rattle that seemed to echo from the standing stones themselves. "For Olaf," Erik said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent grove, "and for every innocent life you've taken in service to corruption, Gunnar Iron Fist, executioner of the Northern Reaches, and champion of a dozen illegal combats, collapsed to his knees and then forward onto his face. The sacred earth drank his blood with the same indifference it had shown to countless other warriors who'd fallen in pursuit of justice or revenge. A collective exhalation rose from the AT team, witnesses, as if the entire grove had been holding its breath during those final moments. Torben's hired men looked stunned, their confidence in their champion's invincibility shattered along with their employer's plans for easy profit. Erik swayed on his feet, exhaustion and blood loss finally taking their toll. The sword fell from his grasp as he pressed a hand to the wound along his ribs, trying to stanch bleeding that had turned his shirt crimson. But his eyes remained fixed on Torben, waiting for the merchant's response to his champion's defeat. "Well fought," Torben said after a long moment, his voice carrying grudging respect rather than the mockery that had characterized his earlier words. "The gods have rendered their judgment." "Then you acknowledge Erik's freedom?" Bjorn called out, his formal elder's voice carrying the weight of legal precedent. "I acknowledge the combat's outcome," Torben replied carefully, "but I fear our business isn't quite finished." The words sent ice through Freya's veins. She started toward the combat circle, intending to help Erik to his feet, but Astrid's restraining hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait," the older woman whispered urgently. Something isn't right. Torben reached into his rich cloak and withdrew a scroll sealed with red wax, the kind used for official documents that carried legal authority across multiple kingdoms. This arrived by messenger during the night, orders from Jarl, Magnus the Red himself. Erik's expression hardened as understanding dawned. What orders? A bounty notice? Torben announced, unrolling the document with theatrical flourish. 100 gold pieces for the return of his escaped slave, Erik Bareborn. Dead or alive, though the Jarl expresses a preference for alive so he can conduct the execution personally. The revelation struck the assembled witnesses like a physical blow. Murmurs of outrage rose from the villagers who had witnessed Erik win his freedom through honorable combat, only to discover that legal technicalities might render that victory meaningless. That changes nothing, Bjorn said firmly, though uncertainty flickered in his weathered features. The combat was fought according to ancient law. The gods have spoken. Ancient law versus royal authority, Torben mused, clearly enjoying the dilemma he'd created. An interesting question of jurisdiction. Does a Jarl's command supersede divine judgment? Erik straightened despite his wounds, drawing on reserves of strength that seemed to come from anger rather than physical recovery. My father can issue all the bounty notices he likes. It doesn't change the fact that I won my freedom in honest combat. Technically, you won freedom from slavery to me, Torben corrected with the precision of someone who'd spent years finding loopholes in inconvenient laws. But the bounty notice predates our transaction. Your father never actually sold you. He had you captured and placed on the auction block to humiliate you before reclaiming his property. The implications hit Freya like a series of hammer blows. The auction had been theatre, a cruel display designed to strip away Erik's dignity before dragging him home for public execution. Her intervention had disrupted that plan temporarily, but hadn't addressed the underlying legal reality that Erik remained his father's property under Nordic law. That's monstrous, she said, stepping forward despite Astrid's restraining grip. No father should have such power over a grown son. Nevertheless, the law is the law, Torben replied with false sympathy, and I'm afraid I'll have to collect that bounty. 100 gold pieces is a significant sum, far more than the pittance you paid for a freedom that was never really for sale. Erik's hand moved instinctively toward where his sword had fallen, but Torben's remaining men had already positioned themselves strategically around the grove. 6 against 1, with the odds made worse by Erik's wounds and exhaustion from the recent combat. However, Torben continued, his tone shifting to that of someone about to propose a bargain, I'm not an unreasonable man. The maiden's courage in purchasing what she thought was your freedom shows admirable character. I'd be willing to overlook the bounty notice in exchange for different compensation. What compensation? Freya asked, though she dreaded the answer. Torben's smile took on a predatory quality that made her skin crawl. You. A woman willing to risk everything for a stranger's freedom would be quite valuable in certain Eastern markets. I could sell you for twice what your warrior would bring. The suggestion hung in the air like poison fog, contaminating everything it touched. Around the grove's edge, angry mutters rose from the villagers who had come to witness honorable combat, only to see it perverted into a trap for human trafficking. But before anyone could voice their outrage, Erik's laughter cut through the tension like a blade through silk. It wasn't the laughter of humor, but something darker and infinitely more dangerous. You made one mistake, Torben, Erik said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made even the hired soldiers step back. You assumed my father's bounty notice was legal. What do you mean? Erik reached into his shirt and withdrew a second piece of parchment, this one bearing different seals but equally official appearance. A formal decree from the Northern Reaches Council of Jarls, issued 3 days ago, stripping Magnus Bareborn of his authority for unlawful execution of prisoners and illegal seizure of tribute lands. Torben's confident expression cracked for the first time since his arrival in Hargvik. That's impossible. Magnus has ruled the northern reaches for 20 years. Ruled it into the ground through excessive brutality and corruption that finally pushed the other Jarls past their breaking point, Erik corrected. Apparently my brother's execution wasn't the only unlawful killing on Magnus's conscience. When the council investigated his recent actions, they found a pattern of abuse that violated even their flexible standards of justice. The document Erik held bore the seals of 7 different Jarls, their combined authority superseding any single ruler's commands. Freya didn't need to read the formal language to understand its implications. Magnus the Red had fallen from power, and with him any legal claims he might have made on his disowned son, which means, Erik continued with grim satisfaction, that your bounty notice is worthless paper issued by a man with no authority to command anyone's capture or execution. Torben's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained composure. Around the grove, his hired men began to shift nervously, clearly recognizing that their employer's confident plan had just collapsed into something far more dangerous for everyone involved. Even if that's true, Torben said, his voice tight with suppressed fury, you're still just one wounded man against 6 trained soldiers. Legalities become irrelevant when steel determines outcomes. One wounded man, Erik agreed, stooping to retrieve his sword with movements that suggested his injuries were less debilitating than they appeared. But not one alone. The sound of approaching footsteps came from multiple directions as armed figures emerged from the grove's shadows. Bjorn led a group of village men who'd positioned themselves strategically around the clearing's edges, while other fighters approached from paths that Torben's men had left unguarded. It seems you're not the only one who can plan ambushes, Bjorn observed dryly, his own sword gleaming in the morning light, though ours was designed to ensure justice rather than profit. Surrounded and outnumbered, Torben's confident facade finally crumbled completely. The man who had seemed so certain of victory just moments before now faced the prospect of capture or death at the hands of people he'd tried to manipulate and cheat. Choose carefully, Torben, Erik said quietly. You can leave Hargvik peacefully and never return. Or you can discover why the northern settlements have survived so many raids by men who thought them easy prey. As the morning sun climbed higher through the oak canopy, casting shifting patterns of light across the sacred ground, the balance of power had shifted completely. Justice, delayed but not denied, finally seemed within reach for those who'd had the courage to stand against corruption and cruelty. The tension in the sacred grove stretched taut as bowstring, each side measuring the other with the careful calculation of experienced fighters who understood that the next few moments would determine who walked away from this confrontation alive. Torben's men had formed a loose defensive circle around their employer, but their confidence had evaporated along with the legal justifications for their presence. Peaceful departure, Torben repeated Erik's offer with bitter laughter. After I've lost my champion, my investment and my reputation? I think not. Then you choose the hard way, Bjorn observed, signaling to his men with subtle hand movements that spoke of military experience older than the raids that had scarred their settlement. But Freya found herself studying the faces of Torben's hired soldiers rather than their weapons. These weren't berserkers or fanatics, they were professionals who fought for gold rather than glory. Men with enough sense to recognize when a profitable venture had turned into a death trap. Wait, she called out, stepping forward before the violence could begin in earnest. There's another choice here. Erik shot her a warning look, clearly concerned that her mercy might once again complicate a situation that had finally turned in their favor. But something in her expression made him hold his tongue, trusting the woman who had already proven her wisdom by saving his life when all logic suggested she should have let him die. Torben's men. Freya addressed the hired soldiers directly, ignoring their employers' sputtered protests. You're fighting for a man who just tried to enslave a free woman and steal property that never belonged to him. Is that really worth dying for? The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire, visible to everyone and impossible to ignore. Several of the mercenaries exchanged glances that suggested they'd been asking themselves similar questions since Erik's legal victory had exposed the illegal nature of their mission. "We have contracts," one of them said finally, though his voice carried doubt rather than conviction. "Contracts to recover stolen property," Freya replied. "But the property was never stolen. The man issuing the recovery order had no legal authority, and your employer just admitted he was planning to sell me into slavery. How? Much of your contract survives when its entire foundation is built on lies." "She speaks wisdom," called out a voice from among Torben's men, one of the younger soldiers, whose scarred face suggested extensive combat experience. "I've fought in too many wars to die for a slaver's profit." "Gareth, hold your tongue," Torben snapped, but his authority over his men was clearly fragmenting as quickly as his plans. The soldier called Gareth stepped back from his defensive position, his hand moving away from his sword hilt in a gesture of withdrawal. "I'm done, Torben. Find another fool to die for your greed." "And I," said another mercenary, a grizzled veteran whose grey beard marked him as someone who'd survived too many battles to waste his life on hopeless causes. One by one, Torben's hired men began stepping away from their employer, their professional judgment overriding whatever loyalty gold might have purchased. Within moments, the merchant found himself standing alone in the center of the grove, his face cycling through expressions of rage, disbelief, and growing fear. "You fools!" he snarled at his departing soldiers. "Do you think word of this betrayal won't follow you? Who will hire mercenaries who abandon their contracts at the first sign of difficulty? Men who value fighters with enough sense to recognize illegal orders," Gareth replied calmly. "There's always work for soldiers who know the difference between duty and stupidity." Erik had watched this exchange with growing appreciation for Freya's tactical insight. Where he might have met force with force, she had undermined their enemies' cohesion by appealing to self-interest and professional ethics. The result was more complete than any victory achieved through combat alone. "Wise words and wiser strategy," he said quietly to Freya. "You fight battles I never learned to see." "Different kinds of strength," she replied, echoing his earlier words about the nature of courage. But their moment of mutual respect was interrupted by the sound of steel sliding from its sheath. Torben had drawn a long dagger from beneath his rich cloak, its blade gleaming with the peculiar brightness that suggested recent sharpening. "If I'm going to lose everything," he said, his voice carrying the desperate fury of a cornered animal, "then I'll at least have the satisfaction of killing the bitch who ruined my plans." The merchant lunged toward Freya with surprising speed for someone who'd seemed soft and pampered. But his attack was driven by rage rather than skill, and Erik was already moving before Torben had taken his second step. The collision between the two men sent them both sprawling, Torben's dagger spinning away across the sacred ground. What followed wasn't the skilled combat that had marked Erik's fight with Gunnar, but a desperate grappling match between a wounded warrior and a merchant fighting for his life. Torben proved stronger and more vicious than his appearance suggested. His soft hands belied experience with violence, and he fought with the cunning of someone accustomed to winning through treachery rather than honest strength. Fingers clawed at Erik's wounds, trying to reopen injuries that had begun to clot. Erik's superior size and training might have ended the fight quickly under normal circumstances, but his recent combat with Gunnar had left him weakened. Blood loss and exhaustion slowed his reflexes, while Torben's desperation gave him the temporary advantage of someone with nothing left to lose. The two men rolled across the grove floor, crushing fallen leaves and disturbing earth that had been sanctified by generations of ritual combat. Erik managed to get his hands around Torben's throat, but the merchant drove a knee into his wounded ribs with enough force to break his grip and send fresh pain shooting through his body. "Kill him!" one of Torben's former mercenaries called out, though his tone suggested professional observation rather than emotional investment. "End it quick before he gets lucky." But Erik was weakening faster than Torben, his earlier injuries taking their toll at the worst possible moment. The merchant's hands found a fist-sized stone among the grove's ancient debris, and he raised it above Erik's head with killing intent clear in his eyes. The blow never fell. Freya had retrieved Torben's dropped dagger and now pressed its point against the merchant's neck with steady hands that showed no trace of the trembling she'd displayed earlier. "Drop the stone," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had moved beyond fear into pure determination. "Drop it, or I'll open your throat right here on sacred ground." Torben froze, the killing stone still raised above Erik's vulnerable head. His eyes darted between Freya's face and the blade at his neck, clearly trying to calculate whether she had the resolve to follow through on her threat. "You're not a killer," he said finally, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "You're too soft, too merciful for real violence." "This morning I was," Freya agreed, "but you've taught me that mercy without strength is just another form of weakness. And I refuse to be weak when the people I care about are in danger." The transformation in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. The gentle maiden who had bought Erik's freedom out of compassion had become someone harder, more dangerous. Not through cruelty or anger, but through the recognition that protecting others sometimes required a willingness to do violence to those who would harm them. Torben must have heard that change too, because his grip on the stone began to loosen. The weight of granite fell from nerveless fingers to thud harmlessly against the grove floor, and Erik rolled away from beneath the merchant's straddle. "Wise choice," Bjorn observed, approaching with rope that had clearly been prepared for this possibility, "though I suspect your troubles are just beginning." As the village elder and his men began binding Torben's hands behind his back, Erik struggled to his feet with Freya's assistance. His wounds had reopened during the struggle, fresh blood staining his already crimson shirt, but his eyes held satisfaction rather than pain. "What will you do with him?" Freya asked, watching as Torben was hauled upright between two of Bjorn's men. "Send him back where he came from," the elder replied grimly, "with word of what happens to slavers who think our settlements are easy prey. Sometimes the best way to prevent future trouble is to make sure stories of current justice spread far and wide." "And his men?" Erik glanced toward the mercenaries who had abandoned their employer when the fight turned against them. Most had already begun gathering their possessions, clearly eager to depart before their association with Torben's illegal venture brought them unwanted scrutiny. "They made the right choice when it mattered," he said finally. "That counts for something in my book." As Torben was led away toward whatever rough justice awaited failed slavers in the northern settlements, Erik and Freya found themselves alone in the sacred grove, where their bond had been tested and proven stronger than the forces arrayed against it. The rune stone still lay where Erik had dropped it during the combat with Gunnar, its carved symbols catching morning light that seemed brighter now that the darkness of immediate danger had passed. He retrieved it with reverent care, his fingers tracing ancestral marks that connected him to warriors who had fought for honor across countless generations. "What happens now?" Freya asked, voicing the question that neither of them had dared to ask while survival remained uncertain. Erik's answer came slowly, as if he were discovering the words as he spoke them. "Now we discover what comes after vengeance, what kind of life two people can build when they're finally free to choose their own path." Around them, the sacred grove settled back into the ancient peace that had been disturbed but not broken by morning's violence. The standing stones had witnessed another chapter in the eternal struggle between justice and corruption, honor and greed. And once again, though the cost had been high and the outcome uncertain until the final moments, justice had found a way to prevail. The sacred grove grew quiet as the last of Torben's men disappeared into the forest, their departure marking the end of immediate danger, but leaving questions that hung in the morning air like mist above still water. Erik stood beside one of the ancient standing stones, his wounds freshly bandaged, with strips torn from Astrid's spare clothing, but his attention focused entirely on the woman who had proven herself his equal in ways he was still learning to understand. Freya moved through the grove with careful steps, gathering the weapons scattered during their various confrontations. The ritual felt important, somehow restoring order to sacred ground that had been disrupted by violence, even violence done in service to justice. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted Gunnar's fallen war axe, feeling its weight and remembering how close it had come to ending Erik's life. Heavy, she observed, testing the weapon's balance with movements that betrayed no familiarity with such tools. Heavier than it needs to be, Erik replied, watching her examination with something like wonder. Gunnar always favored intimidation over efficiency. A lighter axe would have been deadlier in skilled hands, but he relied on fear rather than skill. Fear and brutality. The same weaknesses that made him vulnerable in the end. Erik's voice carried satisfaction, tempered by the memory of how close the combat had come to disaster. Though I have to admit, your strategy with his employer was far more elegant than mine. Freya set the axe aside and turned to face him. Fully, her expression serious. Despite the morning's victory, we need to talk about what comes next. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Erik felt his chest tighten with anticipation that was equal parts hope and dread. The shield-maiden bond had been forged in desperation and tested in violence, but what would it become now that they were free to choose their own path? The bond, he said, understanding her meaning immediately. The bond. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that her presence made his awareness of everything else fade to background whispers. You said it could only be broken by mutual consent or death. That's the traditional teaching, yes. And if one of us wanted release from obligations, neither of us chose freely. Erik's heart hammered against his ribs with sudden fear that had nothing to do with physical danger. Then honor would demand I grant it without question or delay. Freya nodded slowly, her expression revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities that ranged from devastating loss to something neither dared name aloud. And if both of us chose to honor the bond, she asked finally, what would that mean in practical terms? Partnership, Erik said, the word carrying more weight than entire speeches might have managed. Shared decisions, shared dangers, shared responsibility for each other's welfare and safety. Shared life, if that's what we both wanted. His voice came out rougher than intended, emotions he'd thought buried beneath years of exile and hardship rising to the surface like fire in dry grass. Freya reached for the rune stone that still rested in his left hand, her fingers brushing against his as she traced the ancient carvings. These symbols, what do they represent? The history of my family. Each mark represents a generation, a warrior who chose honor over tukka, easy profit. Erik's thumb followed her finger as it moved across the carved granite. My grandfather added his mark when he refused to raid settlements that had already paid tribute. My great-grandfather earned his when he protected refugees during the winter wars. And you? I haven't earned the right to add my mark yet. That comes only after proving yourself worthy of the ancestors' memory. Freya's hand stilled on the stone, her touch sending warmth through his palm that had nothing to do with the morning sun filtering through oak leaves. What would it take to earn that right? Living with honor, protecting those who can't protect themselves, choosing justice over profit, mercy over vengeance. Erik paused, then continued with careful honesty. Building something worthwhile instead of just tearing down what others have created. Building what? A life together, maybe, a family, a future that honors the past without being trapped by it. The words escaped before he could censor them, revealing hopes he hadn't dared voice even to himself. Freya's expression softened, and for the first time since the auction that had brought them together, Erik saw something in her eyes that went beyond gratitude or duty or even friendship. "That sounds worthy of any ancestor," she said quietly, "even if it means accepting a bond you never asked for with a man you barely know. Especially then." Her smile held warmth that transformed her entire face. "Though I should point out that I'm the one who chose to save you, and I'm the one choosing to stay." Erik felt something tight in his chest finally loosen, like a knot that had been pulled taut for so long he'd forgotten how to breathe without its constraint. "Then we're both choosing freely? As free as anyone can be who's found something worth keeping." The morning light slanted through the grove's canopy, painting everything in shades of gold that seemed to bless their decision. Around them, the sacred stones stood witness to vows older than kingdoms and more binding than any law written by mortal hands. Their moment of quiet understanding was broken by approaching footsteps as Bjorn and several villagers entered the sacred grove. The elder's weathered face bore the satisfied expression of a man who had seen justice done, though concern flickered in his eyes as he took in Erik's freshly bandaged wounds. "The immediate danger has passed," Bjorn announced, "but there are practical matters that require attention before this day's work is truly finished." "What matters?" Erik asked, though he remained close enough to Freya that their shoulders touched a subtle declaration of their united front against whatever complications might arise. "Legal ones, unfortunately." Bjorn withdrew a roll of parchment from his belt, its official seals marking it as a document of significant authority. "Word of this morning's events will spread quickly through the northern settlements. We need to ensure the official record reflects what actually happened, rather than whatever version of events serves the interests of those who weren't present to witness the truth." Freya felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of record?" "A formal declaration of the combat's outcome, witnessed and sealed by settlement authority." Bjorn's expression grew serious. "Without proper documentation, future slave traders or bounty hunters might dispute today's resolution. Your bond needs legal recognition beyond the ancient customs Erik invoked." The implications were clear enough. Their victory would mean nothing if it could be challenged by the next ambitious merchant or forgotten when convenient for those with gold to influence official memory. "What do we need to do?" Erik asked pragmatically. "Formal ceremony," replied a new voice, as Ragnar the Wise emerged from behind one of the standing stones where she'd apparently been waiting throughout the morning's violence. "Shield-maiden bonds were traditionally witnessed by the entire community and blessed by those who serve the old gods." Erik's expression tightened. "Public ceremony means public attention. That could bring the kind of notice we'd be better off avoiding." "Hiding brings its own dangers," Ragnar countered with the authority of someone who'd seen decades of political turmoil. "Better to establish your legitimacy openly than leave room for future challenges." Freya found herself thinking of her mother's pendant, now gone but not forgotten, traded away to purchase Erik's freedom in a transaction that had seemed so simple at the time. Everything that had followed stemmed from that single choice to recognize honor when she saw it, regardless of the cost. "If we do this ceremony," she said slowly, "what does it actually involve?" Ragnar's lined face creased into what might have been a smile. "Nothing that should frighten two people brave enough to face down Gunnar Ironfist and Torben the Gold Hand in the same morning." "That's not exactly reassuring," Erik observed dryly. "The ritual itself is straightforward," the wise woman continued, ignoring his comment with the privilege of age and authority. "Oaths spoken before witnesses, symbols exchanged to mark the bond's permanence, and blessings to invoke divine protection for the partnership." "Symbols?" Freya asked. Ragnar gestured toward the runestone still clasped in Erik's hand. "He offers something that connects him to his ancestors and his purpose. You offer something that represents your commitment to the shared future you're choosing to build." Freya's mind went immediately to the wooden bowl back at their dwelling, the simple vessel that had grounded her through. the morning's anxiety, and represented the domestic life they might create together. But before she could voice that thought, inspiration struck with startling clarity. "The dagger," she said, looking toward where Torben's weapon still lay among the grove's debris. Erik followed her gaze with obvious confusion. "What about it? I claimed it when I defended you, made it mine through necessity and choice." Freya moved to retrieve the weapon, its weight feeling different in her hands now, not threatening but purposeful. "If the ceremony requires a symbol of commitment to our shared future, then let it be the blade I was willing to use to protect what we're building together." "A weapon as symbol of peace?" Bjorn asked, though his tone suggested interest rather than skepticism. "A weapon that represents the willingness to fight for what matters," Freya corrected. "The same willingness that brought Erik and me together in the first place." Ragnar nodded approvingly. "Wisdom beyond your years, child. The old gods appreciate symbols that carry genuine meaning rather than mere tradition." As the morning sun climbed higher through the grove's canopy, painting the ancient stones in warm golden light, the informal gathering took on the weight of genuine ceremony. Villagers who had witnessed the combat began forming a loose circle around Erik and Freya, their presence transforming individual choice into community recognition. "Are you ready?" Erik asked quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made everything else fade to background whispers. "I've been ready since the moment I spent my last gold to buy your freedom," Freya replied with certainty that surprised her with its depth. "Then let's finish what we started." The rune stone in his hand seemed to pulse with ancestral approval, while the dagger in hers caught sunlight like a promise of protection freely given. Around them, the sacred grove settled into expectant quiet, ready to witness vows that would transform two separate lives into something greater than either could have achieved alone. The formal ceremony was about to begin, but the real bond had already been forged in choices made with courage, tested in violence, and proven stronger than the forces that had tried to break it. The ceremony began with words older than memory, spoken in the ancient tongue that connected their present choices to traditions, stretching back to the time when gods walked among mortals and honor held the same weight as gold. Ragnar's voice carried clearly across the grove, each syllable weighted with generations of meaning. Erik stepped forward first, the rune stone cradled in his palms like an offering to forces greater than human understanding. "By the blood of my ancestors and the witness of the sacred stones, I claim this woman as shield-maiden, partner in battle, equal in counsel, protector of my honor as I am of hers." The formal words felt strange on his tongue after so many seasons of exile and silence, but beneath their ancient cadence lay truth that resonated in his bones. This wasn't duty or desperation anymore, it was choice, made with full knowledge of its weight and consequence. Freya moved to face him, the dagger held with steady hands that showed no trace of the trembling that had marked her earlier fears. "By the courage that brought us together and the wisdom that keeps us united, I accept the bond of shield-maiden, to stand beside you in darkness and light, to share your burdens as you share mine, until death or sacred release parts us." "Witnessed and blessed," Ragnar declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for powers beyond mortal jurisdiction. "Let the bond be sealed in symbols exchanged and promises kept." Erik placed the rune stone in Freya's hands, its weight transferring not just ancestral legacy, but future responsibility. "This stone carries the marks of warriors who chose honor over profit. May it remind us both that some things matter more than gold or comfort or easy paths to safety." Freya offered the dagger in return, its blade catching morning light like a promise made visible. "This blade was claimed in defense of what we're building together. May it remind us that having is love worth protecting, even when protection requires courage we didn't know we possessed." The exchange felt like more than ceremony transformation that changed both participants in ways neither fully understood yet. Around the grove's edge, witnesses murmured approval, their voices blending into a harmony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. By stone and steel, by earth and sky, by the old laws and the older truths, Ragnar pronounced with ritual finality, let this bond be recognized among mortals and blessed by the gods who govern justice, wisdom, and the courage to choose difficult paths when easier ones lead toward dishonor. As the formal words concluded, Erik and Freya found themselves looking at each other with new understanding. The desperate circumstances that had brought them together were past, but what they'd built from that foundation was real enough to last whatever challenges the future might bring. Bjorn stepped forward with documents already prepared, his practical nature ensuring that spiritual bonds would be reinforced with legal protections. The settlement's official record will show that Erik Bareborn, free man and proven warrior, and Freya Ironsdottir, shield-maiden and defender of justice, are bound by ancient law and mutual choice. Ironsdottir, Freya asked with surprise. Your father was renowned for his skill with metal, Bjorn explained with gentle humor. It seemed appropriate that his daughter be known for her skill with steel, even if that skill was learned in different circumstances. The new name felt right, in ways that surprised her connection to family memory, combined with recognition of the strength she'd discovered within herself. No longer just the orphaned maiden who survived on others' charity, but someone worthy of standing beside warriors and facing whatever dangers their choices might attract. What happens now? Erik asked, voicing the practical question that had been hovering beneath all their ceremony. Now you build the life you've chosen, Ragnar replied simply. Together, as equals, with the support of a community that has seen your courage tested and proven true. The wise woman gestured toward the grove's edge, where Astrid waited with a smile that transformed her usually practical features. Beside her stood tools and materials that suggested plans already set in motion, timber for construction, stone for foundations, everything needed to transform abstract promises into concrete reality. Hargvik has room for a blacksmith's forge, Bjorn added, understanding immediately where Erik's thoughts had turned. Your father's skills with metal were legendary before the raids. Perhaps it's time those skills found new expression in building rather than breaking. Erik's expression brightened with possibility he hadn't dared consider during the dark months of exile and slavery. I remember some of what he taught me, enough to make a beginning, at least. And I know the healing arts my mother practiced, Freya added, her own excitement growing as their future began to take recognizable shape. Between metalcraft and herb lore, we could offer the settlement services it's been lacking since the raids. A forge and a healing house, Astrid observed with satisfaction. Practical foundations for any life worth living. As the grove began to empty, witnesses departing to spread word of the morning's events throughout Hargvik and beyond, Erik and Freya found themselves alone among the ancient stones where their bond had been tested and proven strong enough to bear whatever weight the future might place upon it. The rune stone rested warm in Freya's palm, its carved symbols no longer mysterious but meaningful connection to ancestors who had chosen difficult paths in service to principles greater than personal comfort. In Erik's hand, the dagger balanced perfectly, its weight reminding him that protection freely offered was worth more than power taken by force. No regrets? He asked, though her expression already provided the answer. Only that it took so long to find you, Freya replied, stepping close enough that their joined breath created small clouds in the cooling air. Behind them, the sacred grove settled back into ancient peace, its stones bearing witness to one more chapter in the eternal story of how courage and honor could triumph over corruption and cruelty when good people chose to stand together rather than apart. Their future stretched ahead like an unwritten saga, full of possibilities they would face as partners in the truest sense, equals in strength, united in purpose, and bound by choices made freely rather than accepted from necessity. The story that had begun with mercy shown to a chained giant would continue with love built on foundations strong enough to weather whatever storms the northern winds might bring to test their chosen destiny.